Hi class, it's Dr. DiBiase, and today we are going to talk about our first major project in a little bit more detail. So today I'm going to run through our rhetorical considerations and guidelines for the genre set analysis and case study. So I'm not going to go through this word for word. You can certainly read this at your own pace afterwards or even before this video. In fact, if you haven't looked at it yet, take a look at it before you go any further. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to read it, let's roll through. So before we start thinking about what this project is going to look like once you begin writing, we need to think about who our audience is and who we are as writers, because a lot of the decisions that we are going to make are going to be shaped by our sense of who our audience is and who we are as writers in this particular moment. So we're going to harken back to chapter 2 and the discussion of rhetorical reading and thinking about some of the questions we can ask about the readers that we are going to be engaging with for this project. So again, in the first document regarding this project, I established that our audience is going to be writing studies scholars who have an interest in genre and student composing practices. And as I'll mention later, this actually is a pretty big audience within our field. So when we think about rhetorical reading and we think about our audience, we think about their needs, their values, and their expectations. And I'm just going to run through this real quick, just a few things that you should keep in mind. So when we think about needs, well, why do academics read things, right? We're not reading, we don't read academic texts for things like entertainment or even just for like straight up factual information. We read things because we hope that what we are reading is going to advance our knowledge of a particular kind of topic and in many ways either challenge our thinking or push our thinking into new directions. And so, as I note here, right, we know that our reader will need our essay to advance their knowledge and understanding of the topics that we're looking at. And we can do this in a couple of ways, but most commonly it's through producing analysis that results in some interesting ideas, or, and usually this is paired together, raising some good questions, right? So looking at our data, doing some analysis and saying, hey, this leads us to think about questions that we hadn't originally set out to look at, but that are worth continuing to think about. And this really goes back to that idea of Kenneth Burke's parlor that I talked about in a previous video, that the conversation and the idea of conversational inquiry doesn't begin or end with you, right? You're drawing from existing scholarship and you are contributing to future scholarship. When we think about values, our audience wants to have writing with a clear purpose and makes clear claims. Your claims don't have to be over the top or completely turn things around 180. Right, it's not a full turning around, but turning things sort of on their head. Smaller claims are fine, and in fact, the bigger the claim, the harder it is to prove. And so, generally, academic writing is not, for the most part, producing claims that completely turns a field on its head. It's just stuff that offers small advancements in our understanding of our discipline. I note here that this audience values writing that ties old knowledge together with new knowledge. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we discuss sources and citation. But in essence, a good scholar acknowledges that they are not the first person to be thinking about these issues, and by citing other sources, demonstrate that they have at least a general understanding of the topic before moving on to their own analysis. Finally, and this will come into play in terms of the structure of the paper, this audience appreciates transparency, right? They want to know what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it. First, so that they know that you are acting in good faith, but also so that if they were to try and replicate your process, they might arrive at similar results. And I'm sure this is something that you discussed, thinking about the idea of transfer, right? In science classes before, right, we used, for example, the scientific method because in theory, if someone repeats our experiment, they should get similar or the same results. While in social sciences, it's not always as clear cut. The idea here is that someone should be able to look at your research, look at your methods, and say, okay, those are reasonable methods, and if I were to replicate them, I can imagine getting similar kinds of results, even if I might draw different conclusions from those results. In terms of our audience's expectations, they expect that you're going to make a claim and that you're going to support it with evidence. And again, they're going to expect that you're going to follow conventions of scholarly writing. So that goes from everything to the tone that you take, to the language that you implement, to the level of formality in the writing itself. They don't expect to be entertained. I think this is an important point to note that, often in our everyday reading and writing, entertainment, however you want to define that, is sort of a thing that we tend to value. It's a bonus if it's pleasant to read the piece, or if the academic writing has an entertaining component to it, but that's not the primary purpose, and you don't want to let that distract you from the bigger goals that you're trying to hit. So that's kind of thinking through the reader. So let's talk about the writer then. And here we're going to talk about motivation, exigence, and context. So in terms of motivation, right, what is motivating you in this piece? Well, beyond the fact that you have to do it for an assignment, if we step back and think about what motivates someone to engage in this kind of writing, right? Well, one motivation here is to bring up a question that's interesting to the audience, provide some kind of answer to it, and then convince your audience that you've got a good answer, right? That your answer is valid, that it's supportable, that it has use. And then a secondary motivation is really to show that you belong in this conversation. So, for example, a common misstep that first-year writers often make when they're writing is either referring to the assignment itself in their drafts or referring to themselves as students, right? And while it is an assignment and you are a student, foregrounding your piece with that kind of information actually undermines your credibility and suggests that you don't quite belong in the conversation just yet. In terms of the exigence, right? So remember, exigence is sort of the thing that needs to be addressed, right? The reason the text exists. And this is a little bit different from the motivation, right? So this piece has kind of two different exigencies, right? One is because this is a class and it's being assigned, right? And so it's a way for me it exists because I need a way to see your writing, right? And I need a way to see how through writing you are able to synthesize and analyze the content that we have been discussing last week and that we'll be talking about this week, as well as your own experiences. But more broadly, right, the exigence between this kind of scholarly writing is that scholars as a community have questions that they want to answer, and they pursue those answers, and they need a way to share their findings. And so academic scholarship, right, whether that's in the publication of books or articles or chapters or in conference talks, right, is the means by which that occurs. And so in many ways, right, the idea here is that you have valuable things to share with this audience, or you will have valuable things to share once you're done with the project, and that writing is a way of engaging in that conversational inquiry. I'm just going to make a quick note here about the context, right? So one of the things that's kind of tricky with the context here is that you are not a writing studies scholar yet, right? You are new to this field of study. We're only in week 2, or only going into week 2. And so part of the context here is that your background knowledge on the topic, the major players in the field, key pieces of scholarship is understandably limited. And so as I note here, you don't have a whole lot of background in sort of the secondary sources that you might make use of, right? The scholarly articles that you might engage in. But as part of the context, you are about to attend college. You have just gone through the process of applying to schools. And so there really is almost no one who is more closely connected to the primary sources and the primary experience of navigating the various kinds of reading and writing that go into a college application than you are. And so because that's fresh in your mind, you are uniquely positioned to kind of comment on that. And so you have a place to stand with respect to why there is value in what you have to say on the topic. So when we think about the structure of the project, right, there are really kind of 4 chunks to this piece, right? When you think about how you're going to break down the drafting of this, or the way in which the final paper is going to be structured. And I'll note in the first draft, as we'll talk about this week, we're going to call them our shitty first drafts, the structure can be kind of loose, and it's going to be improved and revised over some time. But basically, we're going to have an introduction section where you lay out what you're doing and why you're doing it and what sort of your thesis or major claim is going to be. We're going to have a methods section where you lay out what you did, how you did it, why you did it the way that you did. And as I note here, this really goes back to the generative writing that you did, right? The process of collecting samples, of looking over those samples, of making notes of patterns or themes, right? That was your methodology. right? And for more information on this, you can check out, we're not really going to dive into chapter 3 of the textbook, but you're welcome to look at chapter 3 when it talks about different kinds of methodologies, and it might give you some insights into how you might want to discuss that. Not required, but something if you have some time that you might want to check out. So again, right, if you look at this, you're going to explain what you're doing. Okay, so we're looking at and analyzing different kinds of genres. How'd you select what you looked at? And then how'd you analyze it, right? So what were the steps you went through to kind of make sense of the information? And as I know, this really goes back to that generative writing. Additionally, because we're also going to be looking at one of your college admissions essays in depth, right? You're going to talk about your process of writing one of them in greater depth. If you happened to write multiple essays for different colleges, you may want to, in this section, explain a little bit about why you're choosing this particular sample. There's no better or worse reasons for why you're choosing it, but you may want to offer some insight into why you've picked the one that you picked. And that will help kind of flesh out the methods as well. You'll then move into analysis, which is going to have 3 parts. So in the first part, you're going to talk about the different genres that you identified, why they matter, how they connect to each other. And I've given a couple of questions for you to think about here, though these are certainly not all of the questions you might respond to, and I might even think of more and add to them over the next day or so. In the second part, after you sort of established our foundation by talking about, okay, here are the genres, here's how they work together, here's what makes them sort of interesting, you're going to talk about one of those genres, right? The admissions essay, and move into our case study, right? Or an extended look at a single example. And like we've talked about, that example is going to be one of your college admissions essays. So in this part of the paper, right, in this part of your analysis, you're going to walk us through your process of composing that admissions essay with an eye towards highlighting the way in which that process was shaped by your interaction with other genres in this genre set. So for example, how did your process of thinking about the promotional websites that you looked at, or going on tours, or communications that you had with various members of an institution, whether those were alumni or current students or administrators or faculty, how are those things that shaped in some way your approach to drafting, revising, etc., this college admissions essay? And it's important to note here, this doesn't mean that you had to have been thinking in these terms when you were doing it, right? Maybe you weren't thinking about it in these terms when you were doing it, but now reflecting and looking back, can you think about connections you can make between how, for example, well, I chose to talk about this particular topic. I talked about this topic because I thought it helped emphasize my commitment to a particular kind of value. I thought this value was important because when engaging with, this course's mission statement site or information that was provided on a tour, etc., it seemed that this was something that was really important for them thinking through who they wanted in their institution. So again, you're discussing your process of composing your admissions essay in a way that highlights how your process was shaped by your engagement with the other genres as both reader and writer. So now by this point you've done your introduction, so you've told us what you're doing and why you're doing it, from an argumentative standpoint. You've gone through your methods, so these were the steps you took to collect your data, analyze your data. In this case, your data would be the different samples or examples of the genres that you're looking at, as well as your case study. You've given us your analysis, so now that I've applied my found all these sources, found these samples, teased them out in these particular ways, these are some of the conclusions that I've begun to draw. You'll wrap up with your conclusion that ties up the essay, reemphasizes what you were trying to argue, why it's a good argument, what does it mean, why is it important, what kinds of questions it raises, areas for further discussion. So we're going to now shift gears and talk a little bit about the formal guidelines. In terms of length, I'm saying approximately 1,250 words. That is give or take 5 pages, depending on your font, etc. But I'll have your word count in the documents that you submit. I give you a rough guideline here for how you might break this up. This is not hard and fast. This is just sort of, as I'm sort of, back of the envelope calculation here, estimating what it might take for you to accomplish this. This is kind of where I think you need to be. Probably closer to 3 pages for your analysis than 2, but there can be some wiggle room there as long as you're hitting that 1,250 words. Remember, because this is a labor-based contract grading system, This is a way for me to mark your labor, right? By looking at the number of words that you've produced, right, gives me a sense of how much effort you've put into this. Now, again, right, this is supposed to be a good faith effort. So, if there's a lot of fluff in there, or a lot of, super long sentences that don't actually say anything, I'll be pointing that out to you in your drafts and as part of your feedback. So just, be warned. In terms of your sources, you're going to have to make use of 3 sources, or at least 3, unique citations in your essay. 2 of those can come from chapters 1 and 2. At least one has to be from either one of the sort of unique readings that we're doing in chapter 4. This is chapter 3. We're going to change that right now because it's actually chapter 4. Or from at the end of chapter 1 and 2, they give a list of sources that informed those chapters. You could go to those lists as well if you wanted to do a little bit of outside research. So again, you're going to have to draw from at least 3 kinds of readings. 2 of those can refer back to the textbook. One of those sources has to come from something outside the first 2 chapters, and ideally from either one of the readings we're going to be doing this coming week, whether that's Anne Lamott, whether that is Nancy Summers or Mike Rose. You'll see that as we move into Monday. In terms of citation, we're going to be using MLA format for this project. I'll be talking more about that during the week, so don't sweat it if you haven't done a lot with MLA. It's not particularly, I don't find it to be particularly complex. I think it's one of the more forgiving citation systems, but we'll touch base on that a little bit more as we move along. Some basic formatting guidelines here in terms of what you need to do. What I really want to actually spend a moment here is talk about the submission format. You need to submit the file as a .docx file format. No exceptions. Otherwise, is a real challenge for me to get those to open on my my home computer because I don't have a Mac. So, if you're composing in Microsoft Word, you're golden because that's the default file format. If you are working in Google Docs, it just means that when you're ready to submit it, you need to choose the option where you export the file as a Word document. Or save it or download it as a Word document, I should say. If you are, and I'll actually can probably show you that really quickly right now. Right, so if you go to File, you can download as a Word document. If you are composing in Pages, which is sort of the default file or the default word processor for Macs, you have the option to export your file as a Word document, and then you'll be able to attach that file to your submission for the drafts. This is really important. I want to make this point really, really clear. The other reason why you need to submit in these formats is that when you submit your drafts, and you see here that there'll be a first draft and a final draft, you want to make sure that your partner who will be reviewing your draft has no problems opening up that file. And a .docx file is the file format that is easiest to be opened across multiple platforms because it's sort of the most common file format for these kinds of documents. In terms of deadlines, you'll be submitting your first draft Wednesday, July 15th by 11:59 p.m. It is absolutely critical that you submit the first draft on time, both because if you do not, it will have a direct impact on your grade as per the grading contract, but also if you do not have it submitted on time, then your partner is not going to be able to respond to your draft in a timely manner, and that will impact the quality of feedback that you produce. And it also puts your partner in a really unfortunate position because they have to submit their response by a certain time. So please be conscientious about when you submit the first draft. Final drafts will be sent out or submitted by July 22nd at 11:59. So you'll have a week between submitting the first draft and the final draft, during which point you will receive feedback not only from your classmates but from me, and that will inform the revision decisions that you are making. And we'll talk more about revising effectively towards the back end of week 2 as you move into the revision process. If you have any questions about the assignment, I will be creating a discussion board where you can post those questions so that I can respond to them, and that way, if two have the same question, they'll see that. In terms of the grading for this assignment, the default assignment is outlined here. There will also be an extra labor version of the assignment that I'll be posting early in the week to give you a sense of what you would need to do to earn additional credit on this assignment if you want to end up with a grade higher than a B in the course. Remember that you have multiple opportunities for engaging in some extra work in order to raise the default grade of the course from a B to either a B+, A-, or an A. But I'll be outlining the components of that sometime on Monday or Tuesday. It won't have much of an impact on the actual composition of the essay, but I'll kind of detail that in the next day or so. So I'm going to leave it here. We'll have more videos during the week to help you make your way through the drafting process. I hope everyone is doing well. And again, if you do have questions about this, don't hesitate to contact me or to meet up with me during office hours or schedule an appointment. Take care.